you very much. If it's okay with you guys, I think what I'd really like to do is just give a view of what's going on in what is an emerging new industry. There's a lot of disinformation out there, and there are very few definitive sources of data, whether it's pricing, volumes, whatever else, demand, even seed types and the rest. But I think it's probably worthwhile to run through what it looks like from where we're sitting, because we are in as good a position as anyone to understand what's going on out there. So it won't be wrong, but you'll see other things when you look it up on the internet and the like. My credentials are that by background, I'm an accountant by qualification, via forensic audit, but I've been doing operational jobs for forever. So that might be gold mines in the Philippines, it might be spin-outs doing cures for cancer out of Oxford, or it might be insurance in the States. So my specialized area is I get involved in companies when they're going through periods of change, or when they're growing, or when they're new. And what's interesting about a new sector is it tends to be dominated by people who think everything is new and how everything has to be reinvented from scratch, when in practice you need some management accounts, some variance analysis, make sure you've got the right people there, and spend as much of your time as you possibly can repurposing things that are already 90% of the way there. So this is a massive opportunity, and we are rather more at the forefront of it than we expected. We went to the States about a year ago in order to find out what people were doing there so we could copy them, like all good businesses. And we ended up buying 3 companies, including the founders of those companies coming to work with us, simply because we discovered they weren't as far ahead as we thought. And actually part of the background to this conversation is that Jersey has managed to, thanks to Lyndon and his team, in fact, to gain a very considerable advantage right now, where there is a window of opportunity to really make good on it. And after I've gone through just the environment in general, I've got some suggestions as to where it might be of interest to you guys from the farming community or the finance and the rest of it. This is a very big industry. It's here to stay, and it is going to be ubiquitous. And at the moment, there are none of the incumbents, for various reasons, perfectly straightforward reasons, none of the incumbents, none of the players, none of the brands occupying that space yet, none of the supply chain or anything else. So whoever moves first and moves into that space and does it right has got a very good chance of being there permanently. So this is a short, medium, and long-term play with some very specific pieces that need to be done first. The accounting is interesting, well, not as interesting as one might think. It's interesting because it's allowed me to be given jobs where they would otherwise be considered too risky. Because if you've got some billionaire running around and they've got a failing company in sub-Saharan Africa, you hire an accountant, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't reflect badly on the person who hired me. So what happens in the first case is you get an unfair advantage because you get the chance to do the jobs that otherwise other better qualified people would do, and then having done a few of them, you end up being better qualified too because you had a chance to do them. So new industries are my space. That's my specialization. And when I say operational, I've never operated in a space with clients, but I've been the IT director, I've been the sales guy, I'm the guy who's cleaned out the loos, all those sort of bits and pieces all the way through. So I'm genuinely operational. And my interest to those guys as investors and the people who back the sort of high risk, high return stuff which this represents are looking for somebody who's bilingual between operations with the different specializations and their world, which is very specialized too, even though the language doesn't look as if it is. It's much, much narrower than one may think. So first off, as I say, the Jersey government has done a fantastically good job of taking a sort of 18-month head start on doing this properly, up to and including real deliverables like adjusting the Proceeds of Crime Act to allow companies like ours not to be having to rely on disclosures and all the rest of it when it comes to the legals. And as a result, we are shifting our topco and our head office to Jersey, which we're in the process of having the conversations with Ogier. So I have to say that we've done this before multiple times in other jurisdictions. This is as good as I've ever seen. I'm being dragged into Westminster next week because there's an all-party parliamentary group we're involved in, and I'm in Washington with the Republicans, helping them with their piece on their sort of re-election campaign in December, off the back of being allowed to be involved with the work that the guys have done here. So there's everything to play for, and there is a genuine competitive advantage right now. So just to give you an idea of what's going out there at the moment, both top down here and bottom up as well from the experience of the companies we have ourselves. The market is already around $20 billion. and it is tracking the spend that the Diageos and LVMH and Pernod Ricard and Bacardi would expect to see from premium discretionary money. So this is the man in the street or the woman in the street going out and spending money on Casamigos or Grey Goose. They're spending money on CBD-based products. Where it's very unusual for an emerging industry, usually, it might be low-level satellites or it might be genetically engineered crops. The innovation typically comes out of the industry, and then the consumers have to be educated and everything else. CBD in particular is very unusual in that the consumers are highly sophisticated and communicate very effectively and have a very good idea of what they want. And they are almost entirely decoupled from the suppliers, which is bizarre, but it just is the case. And sometimes things don't work the way one would normally expect. But this will almost certainly track premium spirits, which means that you would expect to see 70 to 75% of the value in this market in the States. You'd expect to see about 15% in sort of Europe and the obvious rest of the world, and then the rest across the rest of the world. So the assumption is it'll track those markets. And the only reason why the Diageos and Bacardis and LVMHs and Pernod Ricard aren't in this space already is because of the legal environment not having caught up with the practicalities. So this stuff is for sale illegally in London, in Aldi and Boots and Holland and Barrett and Waitrose and John Lewis. It's everywhere. It's in your golf club here, on the front counter. So the regulatory and legislative environment hasn't caught up yet. Interestingly, nobody's against it. So when you end up talking to the policemen, they just don't want the money in the wrong people's hands. You talk to the supermarkets and they want to refresh their product range. You talk to the politicians and they're very keen on being able to tax it when you can do the racier stuff. So you get a series of people saying yes, but. And actually our biggest issue in practice tends to be the compliance department. When we bought those 3 companies, it took 6 weeks for us to transfer our own money to a business we were buying 100% of. And the only reason we managed to get it done is because we are a big client of theirs. And so we forced it through. So those sort of practical difficulties which a proper nation state like Jersey can put us in a position to solve. So we are shifting our head office, because we're purely commercial, to here, so that we can have an international accounting firm and international lawyers and the rest. And until they change process of crime here, we couldn't do that. It's very straightforward. So to give you an idea of the value that my world applies to this, these businesses are worth 15 times gross sales as a rule of thumb, which is straight from the premium spirits playbook. If the racier, sort of psychoactive THC end of CBD isn't legal yet, you will get a 300% uplift on being a brand that can be seen as pivoting into that space when it is legalized. Because that conversation about whether it's happening or not is long gone. And there'll be pockets where it doesn't happen. But even by the time the Republicans are campaigning on it for the next election, it's a done deal in terms of whether it happens or not. It's just a lot of execution to have it happen in practice. So just to give you an idea, that $20 billion there, which is current gross sales, even in a situation where it's not legal yet, that is $400 billion of market cap. You'd expect a market like this this is quite conservative, this graph. You'd expect that as a baseline minimum to double every year for the first, say, 5 to 10 years, simply because there's a great deal of demand. But just to give you an idea, this is ubiquitous today. It's already happening today. And the split is important to note. I know it's rather small at the bottom, but the split is interesting. So it's probably more useful to give you our experience, even though that's a data point that's from our companies. But 84% of the Google Analytics queries that come through to our online sales, which basically mirror the via shop sales as well, 84% are solely as a result of searches about people not being able to sleep and anxiety. Of the rest, the majority are for people who have hurt themselves training and things like that. So people who want to sports recovery and the like. And by the way, not a bad example. So we've gone to see WADA, which does the drug testing for the US professional athletes. At the moment, if you take CBD because you hurt after you've been training, you fail your drugs test. But you can take codeine, which is an opioid, and people are self-prescribing. And in the UK alone, or British Isles alone, we've probably got 1,000 unnecessary deaths a year, purely out of using codeine. Codeine is a $34 billion a year market. Most of it, I'm afraid, is online pharmacies doing prescriptions. So it's perfectly sensible stuff. So 84% sleep deprivation and anxiety. Our biggest seller are bath bombs. And most of the users we have are interested in rather ordinary things. So I live down in Somerset and Exmoor, And people are using CBD cream, moisturizer, when they're farm laborers because it means they can make a fist at 9 rather than at 12. The stuff works great. So it's an interesting space, but the consumers are way beyond the newspapers and way beyond the industry and the producers. So Charlotte Caldwell has been a regular visitor to Jersey, and I think she's probably going to relocate here too. She's a force of nature. And what you guys here have done is you've started to license people to produce medical CBD, which makes a lot of sense. And it's very important, and we should be supporting it and the rest of it. But in terms of the size of the market as farmers, as to whether or not you should be interested in getting involved, it is a very tiny proportion of the market. And in my personal view, it's an interesting one where the medical gets involved with people wanting moisturizer, because there is an established industry to deal with pharmaceutical R&D. There's established methodologies for explaining to doctors what they should be doing when. You know, does it qualify for the NHS and things like that in the UK? So I think they make a great pump primer, and there is a lot of business in there, but we need to, as a group of people who are interested commercially, put the politicians and the like in a position where they can expand it with our support into being able to get bath bombs, because that's where the money is, and that's where the volume for the purchase of the production that I think you guys should be interested in is going to come from. We've got a factory doing white label production for other people as well as ourselves in Denver, and we do the same just outside High Wycombe in London. It's all very glamorous, you know, plenty of parking. So this is not bad as a run through. This is as good as you get in terms of official information out there. And I think the main point to take away from this, because I think the numbers themselves are pretty dubious, the demographic is very much just ordinary people. An interesting twist, 85% of purchases are actually by women rather than men, but the using seems to be 50-50 between the two. And the only conclusion we've been able to draw, but I'd be interested in any other speculation, is that it's just become part of people's regular shop, and there's just got more women doing the shopping. So there's a dearth of information, but it's consumer mainstream before it's legal, before we as an industry are in a position to be able to supply the stuff they're asking for. So the bit that the bit that I really wanted to talk about now is what this means for Jersey and where, in our view, and by our, as I say, I'm chairman of the Jersey Cannabis Services Advisory Board, which should be representing as an industry brand build everyone, whether it's people involved already or not yet, it doesn't matter. So it is absolutely intended as inclusive. The practicalities of not wanting 57 people in the room because then you don't get anything done, everyone recognizes. But one of the reasons I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak today is because we need to start the next stage of allowing people to participate where they should and do it on a sensible basis. But there's nothing very controversial to this because we all need the same thing. And the reason I put the slide up there with the Keepers of the Quake is that, I mean, we do have some investments in whiskey and the like, so it's an area we know well. Scotland did a brilliant job of cornering whiskey as a brand to be synonymous with Scotland. And they've actually done it with a series of quite practical steps. So part of it may have been born out of the fact that you can't buy barrels, you have to swap them between each other. So you've got people who are ostensibly competing who aren't. You know, they're swapping barrels, they're swapping recipes, they're swapping everything else as you go along. But they put in a set of rules. They said, right, it has got to be in barrels in Scotland for 4 years. It has to be with these particular ingredients. It has to be done in this particular way. And they police them. And the Keepers of the Quake is basically industry regulation. So the big players, the big four I mentioned earlier, plus the Queen, in fact, got together and they got their chief exec sitting in the room and they said, right, how are we going to sew this up so that we end up being immediately synonymous with premium whiskey? And CBD is going to go the same direction. We are charging a 40% margin on our bath bombs and our sleep stuff and everything else. We don't have to make overinflated claims about what it does, so we don't actually have an issue with being pharmaceutical. This is a different space. It's quite straightforward. And again, unusually, sophisticated consumers, there is proper margin right from the beginning in this stuff, and it's pretty cost effective to produce. So our issues are ones of not being investable, not that we can't make money out of the business we're doing today. So where I think the Keepers of the Quake were clever is they recognized that Scotland was never going to be able to compete on producing whiskey for supermarket chains and the like. And I think many of the characteristics which led them to get to that space, which took them decades, are immediately repeated here. You've got the financial services thoroughly professionalized. you've got to operate in an environment where if you offend the big countries either side of you, it's going to be taken away from you. So you've got credibility and reliability in terms of your policing of what's going on in the legislation. You've actually got an island community where people have known each other for generations, let alone know each other well anyway, where I would suspect people are already swapping tractors around at harvest time when things go, bump in the night, because that's what we do in Exmoor. People always help out their neighbour and that sort of stuff. But I think that just doing it right isn't enough. I think we need to formalise it and move into what is blank space at the moment. So one of the questions I think earlier was about, what's the point in doing mass market CBD? I don't see any point in Jersey doing mass market CBD. It simply doesn't make sense. You don't have a long-term competitive advantage. But worse than that, it would work for a year or two, just long enough to make you think it's a good idea to spend a bunch of money on CapEx and changing what you're doing. It's absolutely lethal. I think sitting down and between us deciding what is it should look like and what it needs makes much more sense. So my gut feel, and I think many of my colleagues on the advisory board, is this needs to go down the route of being premium from the beginning. We're talking Marks and Spencer's, which we mentioned earlier, and I think Nick worked with for a long time. Marks and Spencer's are not taking ingestibles this year, even though their board has told them they have to start stocking this stuff because everyone's talking about it and the consumers keep asking. That's fine, we'll give them non-ingestible stuff, but Leaf, for instance, are on the accreditation list for Marks and Spencer's for their products. Marks and Spencer's issue is whether or not they can provide an audit trail for something they're being asked for, not that they don't want to sell it, not that they're not asking for it, and not that they can't price it and move it at a level that suits us very nicely. Our customers, being that sort of new wave, even though they're all ages, by the way, so the demographic, 85% women, it's pretty well even between every one of those age groups, which is fascinating. It turns out to be brilliant for teenage acne, which I didn't know about, and all sorts of bits and pieces like that. But what we need to do is provide an audit trail and do that stuff properly as a premium brand. But more than that, we need to use that to allow Jersey to become synonymous with good quality growing. And that means growing to order, which is great because you don't have to speculate on it. It means making damn sure that you insist on having some Jersey kite mark on the side of the box. All those bits and pieces going through. At my end, as a purely commercial animal, I can charge a premium off the back of that provenance. And I know perfectly well that if I turn around to Jersey Hemp and I say, I want this seed, which has been through Scott and it's gone through the process where it's on the government approved list, it then comes back afterwards and the consumer is protected. By the way, 50% of all products out there don't have what it says on the tin. And on the tin, it's not a joke, CBD bonds to metal. So anything in the metal container doesn't have any CBD in it at all. And when less than half, by the way, and this is in the US, a more mature market than here, so less than half having any of the CBD in it at all in many cases, it's worse than that. The suppliers aren't even profiting from it. There's no dishonesty going on. It's because of the various other issues, meaning you just don't have the professionalism in there. And you guys have been growing stuff for a long time. The other reason I like it and the Keepers of the Quake model is, any distillery worth its salt is making up to £1 million a year net out of their visitor centre. You've got exactly the same situation here. It's very important that things look smart. It's very important it presents right. It's very important the garden is done right. It's nice that we're set in a winery here. It's a good example of how it should be done. So I think we need to be rigorous and self-policing it, but the only way we can do that with people on side and engaged is by agreeing those rules with the people who are involved in the first place. So I suppose I'm running out of time now. I suppose my point is that there's an opportunity I'd like to carry on the conversation about, but it's huge, and it's going to happen anyway. Timetable. Now, what's happened at the moment is every government is looking for a government to move first, and it turns out Jersey is the only government that's actually moved. It's not perfect, and it's not there yet, and there's more work to be done, but it's the only government that's actually made a first move. The reason we got the invitations in Westminster, the reason which these guys are going to have to help with, and the reason we got the invitations in Washington are because somebody's looking for a government to have done it. So we're great. We're in a really strong position. We've got to finish some stuff off, but we're in a really strong position. The clock is, however, ticking on that advantage, even though it's taken years to get to. So New York has lost just under 800,000 higher rate taxpayers from Manhattan during COVID. And it's been a long time in coming, but traditionally New York has simply divided up the budget between the number of high rate taxpayers in New York, and that's been the tax bill. It's been creeping up for a while. But those people and their businesses, and these are people taking 10-year licenses, 10-year leases down in Miami and places, have shifted to Miami, Austin, and various other places around the country. We closed down our office in New York a year ago, and we have opened up in Miami because that's the way the world has gone. So New York, which is not to be underestimated in this space. They're very good at getting off their arse and doing stuff, and they're nicely connected in Washington and everything else. They have moved from being an outlier 12 months ago to being the hottest of the competition out there. And interestingly, I get access to their draft materials. It's stuff that we were talking about here 9 months ago. It's the same stuff coming up in the same order for the same reasons, surprise, surprise. When they publish how they are going to be doing it, which I would expect to happen in May at the very latest, they are, unlike Jersey, a heavyweight enough animal to mean that other people can use that as their template. And so your Maltas, your Gibraltars, your Kenyas, your Brazils, whatever else, doesn't matter, all those places will be able to lift that and justify that that's going to be the basis of how they're going to put their legislation together. So Jersey has a competitive, very, very serious competitive advantage right now up until New York publishes how it's going to do it, because then everyone else can just join in. If we make substantive steps in order to own this space before May, which actually means legislation, and it means regulation, and ultimately it'll mean taxation too, but you start off with the first three. By the way, looking at those numbers, you would expect, so you've got an industry that's going to require billions of input. I mean, you've got guys here who can explain. Roughly speaking, 6% of the money's raised as you go along ends up sticking with whether it's the farmers or the people who started businesses up already, or the accountants or the brokers, whatever else. If you have a critical mass as a centre of excellence here, you'd expect to see around a quarter of that going backwards and forwards. You've already got a good working relationship with the Londons and the rest. It makes sense to be doing it here. For us moving, the fact that you're big enough to be a real country with a proper government and everything else, but small enough to mean that we can stand in a room here and have actually people bothering to turn up and having the conversations, and the level of flexibility and engagement and interest, which includes us changing what we're doing where and when. Often we don't mind, but we don't know, and vice versa. It makes it an unusually attractive place to be doing this. So I'm going to stop talking now, but I think my point here is just to give you a glance at what's going on out there, which will happen with or without you, a suggestion as to where it is that Jersey, because it's taken the time and trouble to engineer a window of opportunity, however, having taken advantage of it, Malta and Gibraltar and the rest can't shift because we choose where to take our company. Once we're here, and we will be buying our product from here in order to put it through our product, our products. We need the raw materials, and we'll do it with people we know, and we do it with people we see every day. So anyway, I'd just like to thank you very much for listening, and I would very much like to carry on the conversation with any or all of anyone who's interested at all. And as I say, I'm here on a purely commercial basis, but I can't see anywhere else that makes more sense than here and now. And the actual practical steps required are ones that they're not trivial, but I don't have any doubt whatsoever that if we decide that we do want to do it, that it can get done in plenty of time. It's pretty ordinary stuff. We're just solving for the compliance checklist at Santander and Barclays. We're just solving for Goldman's being able to get us in front of their investor conference in Miami. And they will use any excuse. They all want to do it already, but somebody has to come up with the first draft. And we've got 90% of the first draft done already. And then from there, you're the incumbent and you protect your position. But I think keepers of the quay, Portman Group, Scottish, malt, whiskey, and staying in that space, short, medium, and long term. I think it's a massive opportunity, huge. I mean, I was only half tongue-in-cheek about Jersey Royals. I could see this being as big, there'll be lots of crossover, as the financial services sector. So I think it would be a bit like not signing the Beatles if we don't do it. Thank you very much.